So we all know that the G20 summit has concluded in New Delhi. After the new G20 summit, there was a very important rumor that has propped up among the Indian public. People started saying that, the government of India is planning to change the country's name from India to Bharat. And their allegations were not without basis, because usually we use in the international forums and important summits, we use the name of the country as India. But during the G20 summit, the Prime Minister was seen sitting with the nameplate Bharat. And even before that, the President's invitation during the G20 summit, it also had the name Bharat in it instead of the common usage of India. So in this podcast, we're going to explain what is the basis of all these allegations and what is the basis of all these rumors, whether the government actually is trying to change the name of the country from India to Bharat. What is the history of these two names, India and Bharat? Everything will be discussed in this podcast. First of all, we'll try to see what is the history of the name India. In fact, the name India came from the name of the river called Sindhu or Indus. So people who were living so almost 2500 years ago, this region west of the Indus River or Sindhu River were under the control of the Persians. They didn't have the pronunciation for the letter S in their language, so instead they used H. So instead of Sindhu, they used to refer this river as Hindu. And automatically, people who are living by the river or east of the river Indus or Sindhu were also called as Hindus. So basically, it was also a name which is used to refer the territory as well as the people who are living in the territory. And that's where the name Hindu, which in the present context used to represent a specific religious group in India, came. Now, after the BC 3rd century, there was Alexander's invasion in the northwestern part of India. It was so fierce invasion and the Greek influence in the northwest India prolonged for a very long time, during which everything came under the Greek influence. There were Greek coins, there were influence of Greco-Roman influence in the art and literature. We know that during those times Gandhara art was there. In the Gandhara art, Hellenistic features used to be very prominent. Buddha's hair used to be curly. All these were Greek influence. In fact, so obviously Greek language had also had its own influence during those times. So the name Hindu came under the Greek language's influence, and it is transformed into Indos. So there was this person called Megasthenes during those times. He was ambassador of a Greek dictator to the Maurya Empire. He wrote a book on India, and that book is a very important reference about Indian society, ancient Indian society and Maurya Empire. It is quoted in every history textbooks on ancient India. The name of the book is Indica, Megasthenes' Indica. So from Sindhu to Hindu to Indos to Indica is the transformation of the name India. So the present name India, even though it is of a British origin, it is co-used by the British back in the 16th and 17th century. Its roots can be traced back to almost 2300 years ago. That's what I wanted to say. Now there is one more interesting story about the name India. So the interesting thing is, people within the subcontinent, they were probably not aware of this name India, because it is usually the outsiders or foreigners that used to call the people living in the subcontinents as Indians. There's a very interesting story of a navigator called Columbus, the famous navigator who found out the continent of America. Now, Columbus actually wanted to discover India when he started his journey from Europe. But instead of traveling to the east from Europe, he traveled to the west and ended up in the Caribbean islands. The jubilant Columbus thought that he had found out the Indian subcontinent, so he called it Indies right? So from that name Indies came the present day West Indies. There is a country called West Indies. So it actually came from the name of Indies. This is the history of the name India. Now we know that even though it's of a recent origin, its roots can be traced back to the ancient times. Now let us talk about the name Bharat. The name Bharat is also, in its origin, it is also not a territorial name. In fact, the name surfaces for the first time in Rig Veda, the ancient Sanskrit text. In Rig Veda, there is a mention of a famous battle of 10 kings that was fought in the bank of the river Ravi. That river, back then that river was called Parushni. So we can say on the bank of the river Parushni. So this battle was fought between the Bharata tribe, who was led by a king called Sudasha, and other 10 kings. So the Bharata tribe under King Sudasha was fighting the other 10 tribes. So in the battle, the Bharata tribe emerged victorious, and the lands conquered by the Bharata tribe used to be called as Bharata Varsha. And that's how the name actually originated. So there was another story in Mahabharata itself. In Mahabharata, there is a king with the name Bharata. He is a son of the famous Dushyanta and Shakuntala, and in fact the famous warriors of Pandavas and Kauravas. The Bharata is a descendant of the Pandavas and Kauravas. So it is said that the country's name actually emerged from the king Bharata, who was mentioned in the Mahabharata. Again, these names are actually not widely used during those times, but again afterwards in the literature of Vishnu Purana, there is a reference. The first territorial reference of the name Bharat is actually comes in the Vishnu Purana. In Vishnu Purana, there is a sloka. The sloka reads, Uttaram yat samudrasya himadre chaiva dakshinam varsham tat bharadam nama bharadi yatra santadi. The meaning of the words is like, the country which is south of the Himalayas and north of the ocean is called Bharat, where the descendants of King Bharata lives. That's what the meaning of the words is. So for the first time, the name Bharat as a territorial entity is used in the Vishnu Purana. So basically, when we formed our Constituent Assembly back in 1946 to make a constitution for India, there were intense debates about what the name of the country should be, what the name of our newly independent country should be. So many arguments were raised. A lot of people have argued for Bharata. Some people have argued for in the name India. Most of the people who were Western educated, they argued for the name India, whereas those who had cultural affinity with the India or cultural affinity with this land, they argued for the name Bharata or Bharatavarsha. So let me put out certain arguments for you from the Constituent Assembly. Ambedkar said India has been known as India throughout our history and throughout all these past years. So Ambedkar actually batted for the name India. There was another person with the name Seth Govind Das. So he said the country's name should be a befitting one to our history and culture. And there was another person called Shibam Lal Seth. He said Bharat should be the name of the country. So likewise, there were different arguments. And finally, as a compromise of all these arguments, a compromise was reached with all these arguments in mind. And in the first article of the Constitution of India, it was written as India, that is Bharat. So the Constitution of India starts with the words India, that is Bharat. That means the Constitution interchangeably uses the name India and Bharat. Both are the same. In fact, wherever the name India comes in the English version of the Constitution, in all those places, the name Bharat comes up in the Hindi translation of our Constitution. For example, we say Republic of India, and in Hindi we say Bharat Ganatantra Raj, right? So this is how the compromise was reached. So in fact, for the government to use the name Bharat, there is no restriction because the name India and Bharat are same. If the government doesn't have to change the name of the country to use the name Bharat more. They just can use the name Bharat wherever they want to use it, because the name of the country is India or Bharat. Thank you. So we all know that the G20